Good evening. I'll call to order the workshop for the Arvada City Council for October 28, 2019, and call upon Kristen Resch for roll call.
Mayor Williams.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Marriott.
Here.
Councilmember Pfeiffer.
Here.
Councilmember Ford.
Here.
Councilmember Jones.
Here.
Councilmember McGough.
Here.
Councilmember Miller.
Here.
Okay, Mr. Devon, we've got two workshops tonight. The first is an update on the city housing strategy preparation.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we'll have Jessica Prosser introduce this item.
Good evening, Mayor and members of council. Tonight we're going to have an update on our housing strategy. Just kind of by way of reminder, we kicked this off earlier this summer, and we're probably about a third of the way through the process. So this is really just a check-in and showing some data and kind of where we're at in the process. From here, we will still have a few different touch points with council related to the different toolkits and strategies that we come up with and getting feedback both from council again as well as the community. So, go ahead. I promise I'm pressing it forward. Okay, so just kind of as a reminder, these are the council strategic result and then the subsequent milestones associated with it that council approved a few weeks ago. So it's really to develop a toolkit to promote different style and mix of housing that are affordable to a multitude of income levels. And then we have three different milestones that are being supported by this strategy overall. And so the first one is creating an incentive options and really having a methodology and a process for how we evaluate affordable housing projects that may be asking for an incentive or we're proactively working on. The next one is around a regional strategy to address homelessness. And so obviously the housing vulnerabilities piece comes into this with homelessness as well. We are doing separate work on homelessness as well. And then we've created kind of a list of projects that are current and upcoming, things that are in the pipeline, so we can keep track of and monitor the different affordable or assisted projects that we have in Arvada and which demographics they're serving. So we're working on all of this, and the strategy is really a part of it to tie it all together. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Molly Fitzpatrick, who is with Root Consulting, and they've been hired as our consultant on this project. Some of you have met with Molly already as part of our outreach, and so she is going to walk through the rest of the presentation.
Very good. Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Jessica. I will apologize because my voice has decided to sabotage me today. So I'm going to drink some tea as we go, and we'll see how we do. So I'm with Root Policy Research. We do housing policy research as well as economic research around housing issues and community development issues. We're based in Denver. We work all over the country. And we are, as Jessica mentioned, about a third of the way through our research for this project. So my goal tonight is not to focus a lot on, I'm going to show you some of the data, but my goal here is really to show you kind of the kinds of data that you'll see in the report. And then we'll have some questions at the end to make sure that we're kind of on the right track and ask you what you kind of hope to see more of as we get through the process. I'll also share a little bit of our preliminary findings from some of our community engagement that's part of this project as well. So just to start, the slide currently is showing kind of our overall scope of work for the city of Arvada. The first bullet point is that we were doing some data analysis that informs your HUD required document, which is a consolidated plan. Ed is actually leading that, and that's in draft form right now. So that part is kind of off to the races. The real focus of our work is this expanded housing market analysis in which we're doing community and income profiles, housing profile and affordability, looking at housing needs across the city, as well as barriers to creating that kind of housing that you need or that you want. And then also community perception of housing issues. As we put all of those pieces together, we'll also create a toolkit for council to consider that's really what strategies you could possibly implement, some best practices that other communities are doing to make sure that they're kind of creating the kind of housing that they want and trying to solve some of those really difficult housing challenges. Under a totally separate contract, we are also working for the city as well as Jeffco largely to conduct an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. That is also a HUD-required document that looks kind of at the intersection of civil rights and housing. That portion of this project has not kicked off yet, but I just wanted to, so you kind of have a clear understanding of which is what. You've got a lot of things going on, obviously, in terms of housing studies and HUD requirements. So that's also coming, but is a little bit further out in terms of timeline. So to start tonight, I wanted to kind of review a little bit of just definitions, terms, and affordability context, kind of what that means as we talk through what some of the challenges are. So first of all, what is affordable housing? The federal definition of affordability, and that's sort of lowercase affordability, is about housing cost relative to income. And so the federal definition is that housing costs are affordable if they do not exceed 30% of a household's gross monthly income. And that includes rent, utilities, mortgage insurance, HOA fees, all of this bundle of housing costs. When households are spending more than 30% of their housing costs on of their income, on housing costs, that's called being cost burdened. And we'll come back to that term as we look at some of the data. And then those that are paying more than half of their gross income on housing costs, that's called severe cost burden. So this one sort of affordability definition is about cost relative to income. But you'll also hear a lot of other percentages in terms of 30% AMI, 50% AMI, or MFI, and that's talking about income requirements, typically for housing programs. So when we think about these income thresholds and housing programs that receive either federal or state or local dollars, those have income restrictions, and that restriction or that qualification requirement is based on your income relative to the median income. And so these kind of thresholds show you where those typical breaks are in terms of housing programs and income qualifications. So you hear a lot about 30% AMI or MFI. That typically means poverty level households. Those are, solutions for that are typically public housing or other subsidized sources. As we work up the income kind of thresholds there, you'll see 30 to 50, 50 to 80, 81, 20. So I just want to kind of remind you of those terms and kind of where they fall. The median income for Arvada is in the mid 80s. So about $85,000, $83,000 is the median. That's the middle point of income. And so when we talk about these AMI qualifications or MFIs, it's all relative to that.
Okay, Mr. Marriott's got a question.
I just have a quick definition question. If you'll go back one slide, I think you showed it. And that was the definition of cost burdened because they're spending 30% or more on housing. So is that tested for the overall size of the number? And I'll give you an example. I spend more than 30% of my income on housing, but it's because I choose to have a very short term on my mortgage, and my income is high enough that I can do that, and while the remaining part is less than 30% of my income, it's enough to provide all the other things that we require as a family. But it seems like that's not the same as somebody who is doing it differently than me. So is there any test for that, or are those numbers taken out of the stats you're going to produce us, or are they in there too?
Sure, we don't categorize everything by these definitions, so you'll certainly see other parts of our data that are showing just raw housing costs, raw income, so it's not always, we're not always presenting data through this lens, but I think it's important to consider this lens as sort of the industry standard around how much kind of a household in an average circumstance. So you're absolutely right that especially in different kind of phases of life and of kind of ownership or rentership, households are going to fluctuate up and down on this. And this is just kind of it's a nice measure to help baseline it, but you're right, it's not a perfect measure of what all households can actually be spending on it.
And so you're not going to present us with data then that says this percentage of households in Arvada are cost burdened?
We will show that as well, but we'll also include other data points so that you can kind of frame that.
So my question would be, in those that you present us, are you making any effort to take people like me out of there who are Cost
right.
burden by choice, maybe is a way of calling it, or?
Yes
or-
and no. We don't really have good enough information to take people like yourself potentially out of that, but we do look at that by income level. And so typically speaking, if you're in a higher income kind of threshold, then relatively speaking, you may be more able to accept a little bit more house cost as part of your monthly. Whereas if you're operating at a very low income level, so, at the poverty level, 25,000 or less, it's fairly clear from research that your other household costs, including transportation, food, stuff like that, it kind of stacks a little bit differently at those lower. So we break it out by income as a proxy for that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So one of the questions we often get is just, why do we even have affordable housing needs? Why isn't the market perfectly solving this problem for us? And so this is not Arvada specific or analysis specific, but just in general, some of the reasons that as a community we have affordable housing needs is, first of all, that housing costs have risen a lot more quickly than wages. That's particularly true in the Denver metro. We've had really steep increases in our housing costs. Physical development also of housing actually lags the demand for it, so it takes longer to build a house than it does for somebody to move here or for somebody to need a house. So there's not kind of a perfect match in terms of market response. There's also different philosophies about if and how the government should be trying to address these needs and what kind of some of those strategies are. Another thing that affects housing development and the market kind of supply and demand match is that housing initiatives are often driven by other policy goals or by other community assets. And so, for example, you think about a community that might, really value open space or really value views, and so therefore impose more requirements on developers for those things that may increase the cost of housing. And so there's a lot of things that may not be housing related that are affecting housing prices, broadly speaking. And so there's some of these policy things that impact in ways we don't always see. But there's also a lot of other dynamics that impact housing. So and impact affordability. It's very closely tied, obviously, to economic shifts, closely tied to interest rates and what kind of mortgage you could potentially qualify for, tax incentives. Development is also based on returns to capital, employment levels, demographic shifts, and migration. So there's all these things that kind of make, that impact the market in terms of housing supply and demand and make it really challenging for the market to actually meet perfectly the needs of housing. That said, as we think about housing solutions and housing strategies, we're not only thinking about what do we need to subsidize or incentivize or use public dollars toward, we're also thinking about what are some of the strategies to help the private market kind of meet the needs that we have. And so we know that the private sector has to be part of the solution. The statistics you see in front of you are national statistics, but in general, the private market is providing 80 to 85% of rental units nationwide and 95 to 98% of homes. So private sector is part of this process. It's part of our data analysis, and it's part of the toolkit of solutions that you'll see as well. So with that context, I'll give you a little bit of flavor of some of the data that we've been kind of starting to analyze as part of this process. We're not done with the data analysis, but this will give you a little bit of an idea of kind of what trends we're starting to see. I think you probably know that Arvada is growing, as is the Denver metro. So population is about almost 120,000 right now. That's up about 14% since 2010. We've got 48,000 households, 3/4 of whom are owners. And the median income is right about $82,000. The graphic here is comparing changes in median owner income to median in 2010 to 2017, as well as renter income. You see across the board, even with these peer communities, median renter income is much lower, the median owner income. There have been increases to both of those, but not increases that keep up with housing costs. When we look at your overall housing stock, the top bar graphs are showing renter housing stock by unit type. So basically the darkest shading there is single family detached housing, and it goes up kind of the farthest to the right is like 10 plus units in a structure. So we're kind of looking at the diversity of housing stock in terms of densities and structures. Your renter housing stock is pretty diverse. You have a good portion of single-family renters, as well as some living in duplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and then about 30% of your rental stock is in kind of 10-plus unit structures. When we look down at the owner housing stock, it's substantially less diverse, which is true of all of those communities. And Arvada most closely resembles Broomfield in terms of the actual housing stock by units and structures. So largely single-family detached, a relatively small portion of some of that kind of middle density townhomes and condos as well. As you can see, and as I'm sure that you know, this graphic really shows just the steep increase in home prices in particular. So this is in the ownership market over the last 5 years. And you can see the Denver Metro as a whole has really shot up. Arvada is right in that mix as well. That bottom dotted line shows the United States overall. So certainly our market area is increasing a lot more quickly than the country overall. And Arvada is certainly at a price point that's comparable with the Denver Metro as a whole, but that's above some of your other peer communities. When we look at the rental market, we also see steep increases in rents over the last 7 years. So Arvada rents, the median rent has increased about 34%, but renter incomes have only increased 15%. So we are seeing some increases in incomes, but those are not enough to keep up with rents. So median rent right now in Arvada is about, actually in 2017, was $1,200, and that's probably crept up even a little bit more in the last couple of years.
Mr. Marriott.
So I have a question for you on this particular graph. So this particular graph, starting at 2010 and going to 2017, shows part of the picture, but you're picking kind of the lowest point of affordability and going to the highest point of affordability, and it shows, you know, kind of a dramatic shift upward. Had you picked 2000 instead of 2010, I think this graph would show something very much different. Is there anything about that 7-year time span or the 9-year time span from then to now that makes that the most relevant, or is a longer look have relevancy at all in these discussions?
Great question, and I think the answer is both. I think, you know, in the broader report, we'll have a lot more of the data points, and I think it sounds certainly like it's helpful, and we typically do a 2000 up to 2017 comparison, but we often focus on kind of the most recent trends just because that's what people are feeling right now, and that's kind of, you know, but it is, to your point, it's tricky to look at 2010 as a base year because that's still recessionary. And so really, we can certainly make a note to make sure that we've expanded and look at that more broadly.
I would love to see that at least,
Sure.
at least by comparison, because you're kind of, with this graph, you've picked the most affordable in several decades to the least affordable in several decades, showing something very dramatic, which has been dramatic. But if we're looking at housing strategies and stuff, I think they're longer term than 7-year looks, and
Sure.
I think we need to look at longer term histories, because I think, you know, these real estates are cyclical, and you know, you're just showing kind of the steep
Sure.
part of one cycle. I'd really rather see the cyclical
whole
nature.
sure.
So we have a better look at the decisions we're going to make going forward, not just.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll pull in, make sure we pull in 2000 data as well. I think you'll see particularly in the rental market, you know, that rents were a little bit more stagnant. They rose between 2000 and 2010, but not as dramatically certainly as they have in the last 5 to 7 years.
Well,
so you'll certainly see that.
I think what you'll see is that and particularly, I'd love to see you go back to 1990, to be honest with you, because these cycles are longer, but that you'll see from 2000 to 2010, incomes rose faster than rents. So this graph would be inverted. And then, you know, now it's gone the other way.
Right.
And that's to me, that's
Yeah,
the
to see which
cyclical
one outweighs
nature,
the
and we'd
other.
like to see.
Sure.
I'd like to see what the cyclical nature looks like on some of these graphs, not just.
Yep, absolutely. And we'll also, kind of expanding on that, we also typically look at, on the ownership side, how interest rates are also impacting that affordability over time. Because as we know, interest rates were much higher in 2000 than they are now, but they're about the same now as they were in 2010. So we can do some analysis on affordability with that as well.
And if you're doing analysis on affordability with regard to interest rates, make sure you include tax burden on that too.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, we have next week in the election issues that affect property tax. That, you know, depending on which way it goes, will affect property tax people pay. A year ago, we had the same. I think 2 years before that, we had something else that we get these regular things that impact property tax, that's certainly part of the cost there too. So.
Absolutely, great point. And you know, looking at the median trends at the median income and median rent, median owner can only show you so much. So we also take a look at distribution. This graphic right here is analysis that we do called a gaps analysis, which basically compares the supply of housing at certain price points, the demand of housing at certain price points. And when we say demand in this context, we're kind of inferring demand based on income. So we're saying, look at these incomes, an affordable rent, that 30% of housing cost kind of measure we talked about at the beginning, is basically what we're using as demand. And so you can see on this graphic, the red shading tells us that demand is higher than supply. And the gray shading tells us that supply is higher than demand. And so where you see the red shading, there's basically a gap or a shortage of units at those price points. And then gray shading tells you there's a surplus of units at those price points. So what this really means is that, you know, below, $25,000 of income, which is an affordable rent would be about $625 a month. Below that point, there's a shortage of about 3,300 units. Those households are not homeless. They are just paying more for their rent. They're renting up into that gray shading where there's a surplus. So this just helps us gauge kind of where are those price points where there seems to be a mismatch in supply and demand. And we'll get into more detail as we look at that. We'll also show a comparison of, you know, what did gaps look like in 2000 or 2010? What do they look like now? But this is a little flavor of kind of how we do some of those comparisons around distribution of incomes compared to the distribution of housing prices, in this case, rental units. We also look at cost burden, as we were talking before. This breaks it out as a percent of AMI. That's that as a percent of median income. So you can see the numbers. This is not telling you the proportion of those in each income bracket, but the numbers overall. There's about 12,000 owners and 9,000 renters who are cost burden, meaning they're spending 30% or more of their income on housing in the city of Arvada. I also want to take a couple minutes to talk about community perceptions of housing needs. So we've done a couple of focus groups for the city of Arvada. The first one was actually with developers, private sector developers, and affordable housing providers to talk about what they feel like the barriers to development are, where the needs are in terms of housing price points and housing types in Arvada. And this just gives you a couple of key points that we heard as part of that conversation. One is that they were very complimentary of city staff, so they're great to work with, and also complimentary of the conditions in general in Arvada, that they have generally been enabled development. There's available land, and sort of put Arvada as kind of middle of the pack in terms of comparable communities in terms of fees. So not the most expensive place to develop, not the least expensive either. Developers view the city's code, and that's we asked them about the new code revisions and proposals. They viewed that favorably. Their one, complaint is maybe a little bit strong, but the one weakness they said that they felt like that speed of approval on some developments can be unpredictable or can take longer than they want. That's always true. Developers always want it faster, but that highlights an opportunity if you want to consider incentivizing certain types of housing. One tool that a lot of communities use is a fast-track development. So we'll guarantee a certain speed of approval, or we'll make it faster than another approval to try and help incentivize developers to build kind of what you're interested in having them develop. Another potential incentive tool that came up as part of this conversation was designating a single point of contact or liaison for developers to help them walk through the process. There's a perception in general, and this is metro-wide, that there's a shortage of experienced planning staff, that there's been a lot of turnover metro-wide in planning and engineering staff, and so having kind of a point person that helps walk them through the process and helps kind of liaise that project is a real benefit to developers. Another thing that came up is per unit fees. So think about impact fees, tap fees, those types of fees are typically assessed on a per unit basis. That tends to incentivize larger unit developments. So you kind of make up for your fees as a developer by building something that's bigger that you can get a better return on. There are other cities, I don't think, I'd have to look into locally, but I know Portland or Seattle both do it as a square footage fee. And so that can give developers an incentive to build different products. Developers and affordable housing providers were also concerned about NIMBYism, so just kind of a neighborhood opposition to development in general, and they felt like that was particularly strong toward affordable development, and felt that that it's harder to get an affordable development, and when I say affordable in this sense, kind of the capital A, income-restricted affordable development through a neighborhood process. We also had two focus groups with policy and neighborhood leaders, and just asked what their kind of top concerns were, what they felt like the challenges were. And there was really a wide perspective on needs in those groups. So really people saying that there's need for affordability across the income spectrum. So all the way from people experiencing homelessness up to middle income households that may be trying to access ownership opportunities. Excuse me. That group also felt like there were barriers to turnover in the market, particularly among seniors who may want to move out of a home that they potentially raised a family in, a larger home than they might need, or stairs in their home, looking for alternative products, but not able to find them or not able to find them at the right price points. And therefore, those folks, which were largely seniors, feel a little... trapped is a little bit strong, but feel like they don't have a place to go. They're sort of stuck. They're holding on to a home that they don't necessarily want to live in, that could turn over and be an entry-level house for somebody else. So a little bit of stagnation, basically, in that ownership or for sale market. There's also a desire for alternative ownership products, so condos and townhomes, particularly near transit. There's a bit of a perception that most of your transit-oriented development has been rental, and they'd like to see some owner occupancy options for that. A need for affordable rentals that are affordable to the workforce. So that prompts us to make sure that we'll take a look at different industry categories and wages and compare that to housing prices as well. So not just looking at that gaps graphic we did before, but doing that kind of at a workforce basis or a workforce level too. They also said city's doing great work with zoning update. ADU policy in the city is really, really favorable as well, but that the public may not know about these efforts or know about resources that might help them, for example, build an ADU in their backyard. There's certainly appetite for public intervention, and there was some energy around specific solutions, but it really varied from person to person within our focus groups. So there was some concern expressed in our groups that city policies are not necessarily incentivizing the products and the price points that really meet the need, but there weren't necessarily specific, solutions that the group wanted to see the city address as well. So the city is doing things already about affordable housing, so this is just kind of a quick list of what's kind of in progress right now. Jessica's obviously much more familiar with these projects, so if you've got any questions about those in general, but right now there's about a total of 215 units that are at some stage of the works. And then we've got a map here that shows you kind of the locations of those. The blue dots represent that they have a senior restriction or elderly restriction. The purple dots are not restricted by age.
Can I ask a quick question? Go back one slide if you don't mind.
Sure.
So on this one, and this is really probably more for Jessica than for you, but should we add on to this list the townhomes at 68th or 66th and Sheridan that we just forgave a $500,000 loan for?
So those are existing, so they would be on the next map. These are really units that are kind of in the pipeline that would be new build.
New
Yeah.
unit. But those are newly protected to stay in the affordable, because wasn't that the threat?
Yes.
That they would become market rate if we didn't?
Yes.
If we didn't do that, so.
Yes.
Depends on how you look at it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. And then lastly, we just had 3 questions that we wanted to ask you all. And these are questions that you can answer right now or also follow up with as you think about them. I know I've met with a couple of you individually, but happy to extend that invitation further to anyone else that wants to meet directly, talk about some of these things. But our basic questions for you today is, based on what you've seen, what are the issues that you're most interested in gaining more depth or more insight on, so that we can make sure that we focus some research on that? Any conversations you've had with residents or constituents that help communicate your primary concerns, that we want to make sure that we're taking a look at those as well. And then thirdly, just what other feedback or implementation considerations do you have? And that's specifically around, are there specific solutions or policy tools or development incentives that you want to make sure we include in the toolkit, or that you want us to explore or investigate how they might be being used elsewhere? So I will kind of hand it to you with those questions, and happy to take those now, but I don't want to take up too much of your agenda time either. So any thoughts on those?
Mr. Marriott, you're first.
So I'll be first. I have just one thing I'd like to see maybe reflected in the data, if this is possible. So way back when I first left my parents' house, I didn't think housing was very affordable either. So I did what young people always did back then, is I got roommates. And so with roommates, housing was affordable. And I don't know, this data that we're seeing, is any of this based on, is it all just based on, single occupancy affordability? In other words, a single person making it affordable because they can do it on their own back? Or is there any place within the data that takes into account kind of the normal way that people live and have lived for a long time, which is doubling up when you need to?
Yep, a great question, and we will include some demographic data around what types of situations people are living in, what proportion of people are living with roommates. When we look at income versus housing costs, we're looking at household income. So if you have roommates, we're taking into consideration all of their income. So we typically present our data as a household income need, or if there's, and so that will include multiple earners within households. When we do our kind of workforce analysis and look at kind of different employment or different industries and their wages, we don't just say you have to be in this industry to afford a home. We say, in this industry, you need to be living, you need to have 1.8 incomes or whatever it is. So we will account for that. There's not a perfect way to account for that in terms of, we don't have survey data that asks people, have you considered living with roommates, or why don't you do that? But we certainly will do our best to provide that full landscape of information.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McGough.
I've given some thought to your second question here, considering conversations you've had. What I want to comment on is not coming from any recent conversations, but it seems like one of the underlying issues that comes up when we have public comment before the City Council on various housing issues is perhaps a misunderstanding, or perhaps a lack of understanding of who renters are. As Mr. Marriott mentioned, as a young person, he was a renter. I suspect that most of us here were renters at one time or another. Yet we hear in the public hearings almost a fear or a disdain of those who are
Those
renters.
people.
Right. It's almost that, and somehow or another, I think through our communications effort in the city and through our housing policies, I think we need to be reminded and to remind others who renters really are. And it gets at the heart of affordability. So that seems to come up often in our public hearings. In some ways, sometimes it's a variation of, the NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's a good idea to have this rental housing, but not where you're proposing it.
Right.
And that often is stated in terms more palatable about traffic, infill, just the general notion of density. But I think the most basic question we need to respond to is, who are renters?
Yep.
Who are they? And often the case is that we're serving our own citizens or the young adults who need the opportunity to move out of their parents' basement. And so I think we want to get that message across in our housing policy.
Yep, great point. And we'll make sure that we include kind of characterize renters and talk about what the profile of those folks looks like relative to others. And I think, we often talk about it as kind of a desire to be a life cycle community, an acknowledgement that at different stages of life, you need different types of housing, both rental and owner. You need different structures and that sort of thing. But absolutely, we'll make sure that we include some of that information.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Fiver.
For number 3, the only thing I would add is I'd actually look to, I don't want to offer any type of suggestion around it. I think I'd be interested in what other communities might be discovering, because one of the things that we may or may not know is the private sector's ability to do things on their own. And I think we just need to understand, what does the landscape look like when you're talking about innovative approaches to this dilemma. And I'd hate for us to say, oh, we're just going to waive water tap fees. Well, that's an easy one to give. I would look for something that's more creative and innovative than that, than just looking at waiving the low-hanging fruit.
Great,
Because I think there's other ways to do it. We just don't know about them.
great, absolutely. Thanks.
Great. Well, you met with Mr. Marriott and I, so you've got a pretty lengthy.
I've got all your notes. No,
Yes,
just
good,
kidding.
good. I don't see any other questions at this point. I would encourage those who haven't met with the root group yet to certainly do so. So,
Great. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
very good, thank you. I'm glad you were able to make it through, and
Yeah, thank you. Thanks
Ms.
for
Miller, are you gonna
tolerating
be
my
able to
lack of a voice.
hang
I'll
in
be
there a
better
little bit
next time, I
longer?
promise. Yeah,
okay,
I have some too if you need some.
great. Okay, next we're going to do a sketch plan review on the cottages at Ralston Fields.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I believe we have Jacob Nichols, who will be kicking off this presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mayor, council members. So cottages at Ralston Creek, I always want to say creek, and it's actually field, so I'm going to probably do that more than this time, so I apologize. But this is a kind of an alternative housing strategy, so it fits in well tonight. We didn't plan that. It's just fortunate happenstance. So kind of get right into it. The development consists of 64 for-sale units. It's 24 single-family detached homes, 24 single attached in the form of 4 6-unit townhomes, and 16 duplex units. The single-family detached and the duplex are each 2 stories and anywhere from 540 to 720 square feet. The row homes or townhomes are 3 stories and 800 square feet, and those include a garage. The garage is fairly large. It's interior size of about 12 by 28 or so it's closer to a 1.5 car garage. The subject property is 2.5 acres, and that results in a density of approximately 25.5 DUs an acre, and about 49% of the property is open space. Just to locate it, it's just north of Lutz, 1 lot to the west of Kipling, and it's bounded on the western border by Miller. Let's see here. Currently, it's split zone. The southern portion of the property is actually zoned P1, professional office. The northern portion of the property is zoned RM, so the multifamily. The comp plan identifies it as mixed use. These are the existing conditions. It's currently undeveloped. The old Van Bibber channel goes through there. That's the channel there on the south, which has been abandoned, is located south of 58th on the Lutz property. And there's currently a sanitary sewer main running across the property, and that's the red line there. So here's the site layout. I think the most prominent feature are the 4 courtyards in the middle, and that kind of drives the layout of the entire site. Each courtyard is surrounded by 6 single-family homes, 2 duplex buildings with 4 total units, and then on the north side there are the townhomes.
Mr. McGough, did you have a question? Okay.
Oh.
Go ahead.
And as you can see, the parking lot is on the far north side and east side, so it's screened from 58th. The only point of access is off Miller there on the northwest corner. The one on the southeast will be fire, egress, and ingress only. Along with the courtyards, well, let me actually go back to the courtyards. The courtyards are the developer's idea is to program the courtyards from the least intensive to kind of the most intensive use going from west to east. So on this plan, they're showing a gazebo court, more just a gathering area. And then the next one would be an art court with different kind of art exhibits, and then the fire pit courtyard, and then lastly, more of the active sport, games, things like that in it. And the idea is that these courtyards could kind of morph and change with the residents. Each courtyard would be kind of controlled by the units around it as far as how it was programmed and what it looked like. Also on the very far west side, you have some community gardens. Just north of that is the kind of community building. Currently, it's planned to have the mailroom and a package drop-off, internal bike storage, and then the garbage and recycling area. The developers are contemplating a second story that would be further amenitized, but they're still looking into that. And then lastly, along the south side. You kind of have the rain gardens directly south of the paseos, and the paseos are meant to be more of the semi-private areas. If people want to, avoid the courtyards and as much interaction, they can kind of use the paseos that are also used for the stormwater drainage, and they'll drain into those rain gardens there. And then robust pedestrian connectivity throughout the site. Each courtyard has a pedestrian connection to 58th. You can pedestrian connection through the community building to Miller throughout the site. All right. So this is just a architect's rendering showing a little bit of the interplay between the hardscape and the landscaping. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. So the top picture here is a view from inside the courtyard looking at the front of the building. You have the 3 single family kind of moving from left to right, and then the duplex is the one on the far right there. All of them are elevated and have a front porch. The front porch is meant to activate the courtyards, and the elevation is actually to provide a crawl space for storage. And the developer's really looking at all different ways to get additional storage in these units. Kind of taking some of the best practices learned from tiny homes, putting storage in the stairwells, possibly between the floor joists, things like that. The bottom picture are the townhomes, and each one is very defined through its own roof line. Each one has both the ground floor and the second-story porch and balcony. The ground floor looks like it would enter into a home, but that actually is all garage, with the exception of the door that leads to a stairwell that goes to the second floor. These are the duplexes as they're viewed from 58th. So they're really making a conscious attempt to turn the duplexes so it looks like the front of a house facing 58th. Each of them has a front door facing 58th with the stairwell going down. So really making an effort so when you're driving down 58th, it looks very typical. So some of the design elements that they've drawn from other similar communities, this is just kind of showing a traditional courtyard, little bungalows from the front porch, potential game ideas for the bocce courtyard, different art elements, and then the fire pit, which is one of the courtyards they're thinking about. Again, all these kind of have similar size, small footprint bungalow homes around them. And this is just an example of a kind of a paseo there on the left, and then just another picture of kind of the bungalow style that they're going for. So we feel this fulfills a couple of the City Council strategic plan goals. One, beginning in 2019, 25% of new housing is located in urban centers and corridors. This is in the Ralston Fields area, which is a designated urban center. By 2019, 25% of new housing will be located in neighborhoods or developments that incorporate a mix of lot sizes, development densities, and housing types and styles. This obviously is different than really anything we've seen in the last few years at least. We also feel it's consistent with a number of the comprehensive plan goals. Goal L2 calls for a plan for a balanced mix of commercial and residential land uses. L3 is encourage development of transit supportive, higher density and mixed use, pedestrian oriented areas. This project is about a mile walk to the Arvada Ridge Station. It's also within walking distance of numerous parks, the fields, the field house, hopefully the new redevelopment of the Kmart property, and some of the commercial down that way. Goal L5, designate and promote redevelopment and infill to generate economic revitalization, improve physical conditions, and provide an appropriate mix of quality housing choices. And we also feel like it's consistent with the number of policies which are laid out in the staff report. Another reason we feel this is an appropriate housing mix is the rising single-person household phenomenon, I'll call it. In Arvada, 26.5% of our homes are single-person households. That's a 17% increase since 2000. And our household size is trending downward since 1980 from 2.98 to 2.5. This is on par with the national trend, which is 28% of homes, and whereas in 1960 there was 13% homes, and so that's a 115% increase. So some of the policy considerations that we need to think about to accommodate a development like this: we have the 150-foot setback from the center line of arterials, which West 58th is. We'd need to drop that to about 85 feet for this development. The developer considered just putting the parking lot in the front, and they could come real close to meeting that 150. They wouldn't quite get there, but they could come close, and that would also they wouldn't need to remove that sanitary line, so it would save some money for them. But we think it's a much better project with the parking hidden in the back and around the east side than the first thing you see from the street. Reduce the minimum parking. If we parked it at a 2.2 per unit, which is the code requirement, 140 spaces would be required, sorry, and they're asking for a reduction down to 110 spaces, which results in a 1.72 spaces per unit. Lastly, we'd have to modify a couple small landscaping standards. There's a required buffer on the east side due to the adjacency of the medical or the professional office or medical office building there. That would require a 20-foot buffer to the second person in, the last person in this case, I guess, and along with some fence treatments and a certain amount of trees. They are requesting just a 5-foot buffer, and the fence treatment would be met. And then reducing, something else that I guess of note on that is that side of the property, there is the double loaded parking aisle. So the closest building is over 70 feet from the actual property line. So there is a large setback. It's just doesn't meet the landscaping requirement. And also the site is 49% open space. So while they're not maybe meeting the landscaping there, they are far exceeding the minimum open space requirements throughout the site. And then lastly, we have the requirement that says for every 12 parking spaces, you have to have, in a row, you have to have one parking island. They would ask that to be reduced in a couple of cases where they'd have 13 or 14 in a row before they'd have an island. And then lastly, I guess it's not on the slide, but we'd also have to consider lot sizes. Our code doesn't accommodate developments like this from a lot size perspective, and they're still exploring how that'll look. They might condo them. They might be lots that literally just go around the outside of the building. They might be a 0 lot line on one side and then a 5-foot setback up to the next house and kind of going down the row. So we'd have to get comfortable with a lot size or lack thereof that's not currently in our code. So that's all I have for you. I'd be happy to listen to any feedback you have, answer any questions.
Mr. McGough, you're first, then Mr. Pfeiffer.
Yes, thank you. The project is intriguing and I think a very good one. A lot of favorable comments about it from me. I like the overall approach. I like the courtyard concept. I think it works well. I have lived in a courtyard apartment complex like this many years ago, and it does, in fact, or at least my experience was that it activated it very much where people really got to know each other, so I like that. The most troubling question I have has to do with parking, and that is it the developer's intent to have assigned parking monitored and some enforcement of the parking in this project?
Yeah, the developer is definitely open to all sorts of solutions for parking, whether that be deed restricting the number of cars certain units can have, so only a certain number of units could have 2 vehicles versus 1, assigned parking, guest parking. Those are all things we've discussed with them. They are exploring what other developments like this have done, and they'll definitely have a game plan when they come before you with the actual plan, assuming
okay, so they're open to having assigned parking monitored in some way. It would seem to be crucial. Okay, two things. One, it kind of comes up from the last workshop we had this evening. They're talking about the affordability and the barriers to turnover. At least, and one of the points that was made is that people who wish to downsize have not as many options as might be desirable. So this would add another option, which I think is a favorable thing. On a more troublesome side too is there is the access within reason to get to the transit station and to get to the business area east of the project. But gosh, I've done a lot of walking tours, walking within the city from point to point, and I have people who just simply will not cross either 58th at that point or Kipling at that point. It's just a formidable barrier with the number of lanes that are in there. So it doesn't seem to me that that's a selling point at all, that access is there, unless there were some way, and I'm certainly not advocating, and I'm not sure what might be done, but last week, recently, we listened to a presentation where they were narrowing a few of the intersections to at least reduce the distance in crossing the street. Both of those are truly formidable barriers to walking. They're not truly access to either of those points. So, and that is not a conceptual thing. That's an experience in trying to get people to cross in those areas. They just stop and say, we won't do it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pfeiffer?
So I agree with a lot of what Mr. McGough said. I would only add, I wish we saw some like single-story ranch mixed in there a little bit, just because you'd open up a diversity for our senior living, our senior population to be able to live in this community. That'd just be a suggestion, which might, lower the parking demand. It might solve if just a few units were mixed in as single story. And then the other question is I think the bus is still running on 58th, isn't
Yes.
it? I
Yeah,
always
there's
have to
a stop,
kind of
both
remind
of-
myself because I never know when RTD cancels things
Yeah.
or not. So the bus on 58th, that will take them because I think there's a bus stop right in front of this
There is,
property.
right on
So
both eastbound and westbound, right,
Yeah, so
adjacent to their property.
I think I have to agree with Mr. McGough if we could just make sure, especially if we're going to reduce the parking requirements, that there's some sort of thought put around access to the mass transit, either via bus or the ability to cross, because they're going to have to cross coming on the other direction to get back home or go to home or get to work safely across the street there. And it might not be a bad idea to talk about it in general anyways, because of the sports complex, a lot of people cross in that area trying to get over to Starbucks and stuff anyway. So might want to put some thought about how pedestrian movement is so that encourages less vehicles and less demand. But in that, I agree with everything that Mr. McGough said.
One of the things they are considering is making the duplex stacked flats instead of side-by-sides and creating a ramp up to the ground floor unit so that would be completely accessible. It's definitely one of the things they're thinking about, and they'll know the answer to that when they come back before you, assuming they do. So,
Mr. Marriott?
A couple questions. Any idea roughly what the footprints of the single-family residence and duplex buildings are?
yeah, 360 square feet.
360 square feet.
Yeah, so the 540 is essentially a floor and a half. They're anticipating that that's the main floor plan they'll probably see because people will want that open vaulted ceiling on the main area to
Right.
make it feel a little larger. The 720 square feet would be if it was total first and full second floor.
Right. So is that about 10 by 30 or 10 by 35 or something like
yeah,
that? Is
it's
that-
15 by 24, and
15
I
by
believe
24,
that's total footprint. So we're not taking off, 6 to 8 inches for wall widths and things like that.
Right. Okay, sounds good. And is there a plan for utilities for each one of these to have an individual water and sewer tap, just like if they were single-family homes?
We're still in discussions with that. We're exploring options. One option would be to master meter each courtyard, and then run service lines to each of the units from the master meter, and do it that way. But those kind of discussions are still actively taking place. We wanted to get through the sketch plan process
Right.
Before we started really diving
Deciding,
into that.
yeah. Okay. So one of the things that strikes me about these is that in the photos show that, they're incredibly attractive photos of other places that are like this with beautiful units and terrifically landscaped courtyards and all that. But it seems to me that for the quality of life and the quality of these folks, that those have to stay that way. And it seems to me that that's an HOA function. So is there anything about either our code or anything that gets added to developments like this that require enhanced HOA activity or something? I think of so many places in the city where HOAs go kind of fall asleep and go dormant after a while and don't really provide any function. But in something like this, it seems like it's really necessary that they're active and.
Yeah, and that's difficult because they are a private agreement, really, when it comes down
Right.
to it, amongst the homeowners. So after they get all their approvals and they're up and running for a while, yeah, they can opt out of that. That's something that we can look into. You know, they're exploring different options, such as having each courtyard have its own HOA, and you know, some of the things they've talked about is kind of trying to promote friendly competitions between the different courtyards as far as property maintenance and you know,
Right.
look goes, kind of like you see in some master plan communities where there's the yard of the month and thing like that. So
Yeah.
they are consciously thinking of what they can kind of build in to the development that might encourage those types of things.
Right. Okay, a couple more questions. So is 58th Avenue kind of in its ultimate configuration? Is there any plan for 58th Avenue to ever be wider than it is, or different type of pedestrian facilities than it currently has, or is it kind of fixed?
As far as I've heard, it's fixed. You know, we've ran this through all the referrals, and there's been no indication that we need to get some extra right-of-way or anticipate any. I mean, to that, you know, the nearest building is about 29 feet from the back of the property line, which is behind the sidewalk. So there is some area there if it were ever needed.
If it ever happened, okay. One last one, and that's that's this channel on Van Bibber Creek. That's totally abandoned, so it can be just filled in and done away with?
Yeah, and I kind of skipped over that a little fast. It is abandoned as a little bit to the west, so.
Okay, that was going to be my question. I was
Yeah.
going to say, what happens to it
It's
west
really,
of here?
Yeah, it's really only catching surface runoff from, I can't read the street names there from here, but, you know, just two streets down from Miller. And so what the plan is then is they'll capture all that, and rather than run it all the way through that channel, they'll put it in a culvert at the west side of their property and run it down to the Van Bibber. So they'll just divert the little bit of surface flow, but it's not handling nearly what it was when the Van Bibber was running through there. It's literally just the runoff from the adjacent properties.
Right, okay. So there's no issue
No.
with them being able to do that. Okay, sounds good. So I'll just make a comment. I think I like the idea of this. It's definitely something different. I definitely prefer this kind of a look at it over having the parking along 58th and in front. Like always, I worry a little bit about parking in residential things. This does have, I noticed from the photos, street parking. And I suppose that's the thing. If someone arrives home and there's not a spot for them, they go just park out on Miller Street adjacent to the park or whatever. I would hate to create a situation where that's what our plan is that some number of cars would be there, but it's nice that exists. So I'm not as concerned with that here. I like the idea that the applicant is looking at something positive for the parking as far as some kind of strategy for either the number of cars they allow or some way of dealing with it. And so I think I'm highly favorable to something like this. I think it's a really good spot to try it, a good solution for this spot, and I think they've done good work up to here, and so I'm liking what I see.
One thing to note is these units and their very size, they're not the place where you're going to be having the Super Bowl party, and it's not, grandma's not going to decide to throw the graduation party at this house most likely, given the size of them. So hopefully we won't see some of those types of events happening here like we would in a typical neighborhood.
Ms. Ford?
So as I was reading all the reports, the first comment that I would have is that I do think that this project stretches the L3 goal a little bit, looking at a property that's 1.2 miles from the station versus a half a mile, especially because I believe that there's a fairly good-sized hill, too, going up to that train station. And the other thing that I struggle with on this project, and I will say that, from all the looks of it, it's creative. However, I struggle with the diversity of this project because I really don't see people leaving their homes and buying a 1.5 to 3 story unit as a retired person, struggling with the aging process. So, I see. So the question that I guess I had with it is, first of all, I don't know who Ross Chapin is. What research has been done on pocket neighborhoods? You know, I'm sure this is a fairly new concept, maybe that has some old concepts with it. You know, who lives in these places generally? Is it generally younger people? Because if that's the case, then I'm struggling with the diversity of it, because I really do believe that this community needs one story, and I'll agree with Councilmember McGough and Pfeiffer that we do need one-story units. We are, you know, lacking in them for our population that wants to move out of their home and be able to downsize. You know, one of the policy considerations mentioned about changing some of the design to help activate the street, and I guess one of my questions reading that was, well, how active is the street today in the first place, and would that really matter? I do struggle with the 30 less spaces, because I think people are going to be driving. I can't imagine more than one person living in a unit like this, but one never knows. You know, given the small square footage of them, I'm assuming it has to be someone who's just starting out, because anybody who's ever owned will have to get rid of everything they own to live in a place this small. And then, you know, what I would want to hear is, you know, it mentions the developer being very confident in the parking ratio and that they're comparing it with similar projects. I would like to know what those similar projects are and how they're defined as similar. The other question that I had also is this balance of commercial and residential. It says that, you know, it helps in the balance of the mix of commercial and residential. And I'm really unsure how that does this. So I would probably want that explained to me, because sitting here, I would say a good many of the projects that we see are residential. So I'd like to know what the definition of a balanced mix of commercial and residential is. So those are kind of the things that I'm looking at more seriously, is how we look at our goals and try to fit projects into those goals. Because I just, to me, this is not a transit-oriented area, even though there's a bus. Where does the bus go?
The bus is the 58th, the line that runs east-west from 58th into the transit center. I'll have to get the exact route where it all stops, but yeah, the Old Town Hub, I believe.
So you have to work somewhere along the line.
Yes, or you'd ride it to the rail.
Assuming that you're going to take that bus.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And then the other question that I would have is, we talk about affordability. What are we looking at in a project like this? These are for sale, correct?
Yeah, and you know,
what range are we looking at?
The developers is shooting for the first number starting with the 2 and staying closer to the bottom end than the high end. So they're hoping to stay in the 2s. And it's a little early, I think, to really completely vet that out. But that's what their goal is. Yeah.
Okay, that would be interesting too, because for me, I look at my complex, we're in the 2s, reaching the high 2s, and we're twice the size. Mm-hmm. So it'd be interesting to see what a new development would cost.
Great. Ms. Miller?
Thank you. I love this project. I think it's fantastic. I think it's great for first-time home buyers that want to move into Arvada, and right now they can't afford it. I think this adds to our diversity of housing stock. I think it's great. I love the concept. The paseos in the back remind me of Europe. I would absolutely live here. Great job.
Thank you. And to the kind of demographic question, the developer sees a mix of, you know, like a lot of the smaller housing, a mix of the people that are wanting to downsize, the empty nesters and the first-time home buyer, the young professional, and they're anticipating that a lot of them will be single-person occupancy, and there's really not a choice. There's not a lot of housing choices for that demographic out there, so that is one of the targeted groups that they're exploring or looking at.
Mr. Jones?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is, I like it. Just a couple of questions. The 400 square foot studios with the 1-car garage, how much space is really going to be in the garage? Is it really, I know that my truck probably wouldn't fit in there. Is it going to be more for like a smart car kind of?
No, the garages are big on those units because it's a whole ground floor. And those aren't the studios. Those are the 3-story townhomes that are along the north side. Along the north side here, the kind of frame the northern side of the courtyard. The outside dimension is 13.3 feet by 30 feet in depth.
Okay.
So even internal dimensions, you're looking at somewhere 12 feet wide by 28 feet long. So it's plenty large for a garage. That's why I called it more of a 1.5 car garage. You could easily, you know, if you were collected little Fiats or something, you could probably get 2 in tandem style. Or you could have enough room for your motorcycle, your bikes, your kayak, and a full-size vehicle.
Okay,
They're
no, that
pretty
makes
large.
sense. And I think that's a great option, and that'll certainly help with the parking, because you're not counting those garages as part of the
No,
parking
we are.
ratio.
They are counted in the total parking count.
Okay.
Yep.
And then with regard to the trash and recycling, so it looks like everybody, you know, that lives on the far east side, they're going to carry their trash down the sidewalk to the trash and recycling bin?
Yes, and that's something that they'll speak more of as how they program these, and the idea that that people self-select to live in these. These are not for everybody. We couldn't build these throughout the community and make people happy. These are people that are self-selecting to live in this unique kind of community-driven development. And so one of the things the developers seen in other units kind of like this and exploring is you have garden carts or little wagons in the development, and maybe red ones are for trash and blue ones are for groceries and stuff like that to take from your car or take garbage there. So they're definitely looking at all that. And these kind of developments are gaining popularity, and they do have a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. And there's a lot of interesting work that's gone into these and interesting ideas. And they are really exploring all of those. And when they come back in front of you, they'll have more specific answers, but those are kind of some of the things they're exploring.
Okay. No, and I think that's great, because again, I was thinking, you know, if that were me, I might come up with my own way to get my trash down there, throw it in my car or whatever, but.
Hang it off the windshield mirror.
That's right, hold it out the window as I drive, yeah.
That's what I do every time I go
Toss it in.
camping.
That's right.
Yeah.
But no, as far as the package delivery, what can you speak to that? I'm assuming that's like for UPS to drop stuff off and there's lockers or something?
Exactly. It's going to be, and I haven't really seen a lot of these. I've heard about them in, you know, the downtown buildings and stuff where, you package, you get a code or whatever, you go down, enter in your code, that door opens up for you. It'll also be the central mail room too. And the nice thing is one thing we're not counting is they do have an off-street loading space right there for the UPS van or the FedEx truck, and we're not counting that as one of the parking spaces, but they're providing that directly on site. And it's close to the street, so hoping that the drivers will actually take the time to pull off of Miller and to pull into that spot and not congest the street or park behind a car that needs to get out or something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, outside of it was more curiosity on those things, but I think, again, I believe this is a diversity of housing stock that we don't have in the city, and it certainly, it's going to check the box for a certain person or persons to consider this. But I think it's kind of a cool idea. I was kind of hoping that they were going to be more igloo style, but outside of that, I'm good.
That's diversity.
Yeah.
Solana has that kind of package drop-off place.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So they've got
In some
that,
places, they end up renting a golf cart and making the rounds, and there are other options too like that. So they're exploring all of those.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, the concept is, I like Mr. McGough's term, intriguing. I think it is something that, and I also like the term that it checks a box because it is a different type of use. It certainly wouldn't work for me, but I think that there are demographics out there, either empty nesters or first-time buyers. We've often talked about, getting that gateway into home ownership, and this certainly does it. I would think some people might live here long-term, others would, use this and then, sell it or rent it out and move on. But I like the concept. I like the elevations. The concepts are good. In terms of a ranch style, because of how small the footprint is, I don't know if it's real feasible as a ranch. So, that's probably not going to work. But, you know, there might be an option for doing a small first floor master, you know, type of flat if somebody wanted to try to do it that way. But overall, I think the concept's great. I like the feedback we got from the Planning Commission. I'll look to see, I think it'll be important as this is presented to council in the future, what kind of success there's been, because we obviously want a successful project, you know, so it would be good if the applicant could show some examples of projects that have been successful and some of the best practices that they've seen from those moving forward. You know, it's going to be important that that the HOA does properly maintain these properties because they are more entry level. I think it's going to be important to make sure that there is constant upkeep and maintenance. You know, the community I live in, you know, the HOA collects so that they can paint every unit, you know, once every 7 years, and I think something like that might be a good approach for something like this. You know, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. So overall, I'm impressed. I like the concept. It fits I think it fits a need. So let's see how it moves forward.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. McGough.
Thank you. You asked about examples. I just called to your attention that there's quite a few small houses about this size, not in Arvada, but probably ought to be in Arvada. It's at 76th, just this side of Sheridan.
That doggone Westminster, they just
Yes,
land
it's
grabbed.
Westminster, but there's it's not HOA, it's just individual houses, and there are some issues there because they are single-family houses, a lot of cars parked in the streets, worker trucks parked on the street, et cetera, et cetera. But to take a look at the houses, the diversity of the housing, just on the north side of 76th and about Chase Street. And then actually, within that neighborhood to the north there are several of these small houses. So we don't have to go very far to see an example of these.
Great. Thank you. Very good. Mr. Devon, anything else you have?
No, Mr. Mayor, just a reminder, no council meeting next Monday.
Correct. Okay.
What's the occasion?
Mr. McGough, thank you for your service. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Very good. We're adjourned.